I act on behalf of the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People, and that's a statutory office, as my lady knows, established with the principal aim of safeguarding and promoting the interests of children and young people. And that's a group that, as at the last census, represented approximately 21% of the total population. And that includes significant numbers who were disproportionately adversely impacted by the pandemic, such as approximately 330,000 in school, with over a quarter of them from poor households, 22 regarded as being in need, and somewhere between 17,500 and 30,000 acting as young carers. And it's a matter of some concern that we don't actually know how many of them there are. Written submissions have been provided that give further details about numbers and impacts and the need to have the UNCRC incorporated into domestic law, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But what I do want to do is use the opportunity that my lady has kindly given us to do two things. Firstly, to address what children and young people in Northern Ireland went through and the continuing impact of them. And second, to highlight what they still don't know, despite being 5 years away from the onset of the pandemic. So what they went through. Now, much, as my lady knows, has already been set out, analysed and explained about the impact on children and young people of the pandemic and the government's responses to it. What I want to do now is to use their words from a representative sample of what those who were vulnerable went through. And my lady has already had some examples of them, but sometimes it's the words of children and young people that speak most eloquently as to the impact on them. So LOD, 10 years at the start of the pandemic. COVID impacted so many people. For me, I lost my grandfather as his cancer treatment was stopped due to hospital pressures, and we cared for him at home until he died in July 2020. I was 10, and I remember reading our favourite book to him just before he passed away, one that he had read to me so many times. Guess How Much I Love You? Well, I loved him to the moon and back. I and many other children lost access to educational paths that we had hoped for. The post-primary transfer test was suspended unexpectedly the week before I was due to sit the first exam. I'd hoped to go to grammar school and applied for them, but in June 2021, I found out that I was unplaced and I had no school to go to. Following many appeals, I got access to my current school, and I started about 2 or 3 weeks later than everyone else. I suffered anxiety for the first year, and now even in year 12, I still have that doubt in my mind, do I really deserve my place here? For some, COVID may seem to be in the rearview mirror, but for others, it's still in the driving seat, both psychologically and educationally. It may be 5 years ago, but its continuing impact cannot be forgotten and must be recognised and considered. And Seren, who speaks on behalf of Molly, who was 8 years old, I live in a household with clinically vulnerable family members. My sister Molly and later my dad are both vulnerable to infection due to their health conditions and disabilities. And we don't fit the typical story that the lockdowns were detrimental, as my sister and I really thrived. The lockdown periods where everyone had to stay at home meant that my family was safe. People were more empathetic, particularly around protecting the most vulnerable. And due to her disabilities and clinical vulnerability, Molly was one of the first cohort of children to be prioritised for vaccines. The vaccination clinic had no ventilation, and our mum and Molly were the only two wearing masks. In order to protect Molly from the effects of COVID, we had to put her at risk of being in close contact with unmarked staff to access the vaccine needed to protect her. People often refer to COVID as a period in time, in the past sense, not the damaging virus that it is. But for families like mine, it continues to be an ongoing risk and has led to inequalities and unnecessary health risks. Families like ours can choose to avoid crowded indoor settings where there is a higher risk, but schools and healthcare settings cannot be avoided and therefore need to be made safer for everyone. Seren, who was 13, lockdowns were when I felt safest, and it seemed like there was better understanding about vulnerable families like mine. But I eventually had to go back to school, and mitigations began to be lifted. There was no real understanding. The risk to my family was still there. I continued to wear a mask, to try my best to protect my sister, and I asked for windows to be open for ventilation. I was eventually the only child wearing a mask and became a target for bullying, not just from other students, but staff and even parents. I was coughed at, sworn at, verbally abused, physically abused, had windows slammed shut, and experienced targeted abuse on social media, and it only got worse over time. I tried explaining the risk to my sister, but people said things like, well, you and your sister should just kill yourselves. And I don't care if your sister dies. School became terrifying. The failure of my school to manage the very real risks from COVID and the behavior of other people forced me to make the decision to leave school halfway through my A-levels. All my teenage years have been impacted by the pandemic. We were told to protect the most vulnerable. But why, as you've heard from the film, was it my responsibility to make sure my school was safe for me to attend? My sister is now 13 and still extremely vulnerable. Outside of my family, who's protecting her now? NICCY, which is not her real name, 13. Throughout the pandemic, I felt isolated and voiceless at times. Shortly before the pandemic, I began to be unable to attend school due to mental health difficulties and undiagnosed learning difficulties. When school closed, I began to learn at home, and due to experiencing homelessness, I was left in an overcrowded housing situation with 4 other relatives, including one of my parents. So not only did I struggle to find a quiet space for learning, but also to somehow fill the blanks of months of missed teaching. I never returned to school full-time, which led me to leaving school at 16 with no qualifications. I feel as though disabled young people and those with learning disabilities were not considered almost at all during the pandemic, and very little was done to support us. I feel as though young people were constantly being scapegoated throughout the pandemic and being blamed for spreading the virus, even though many, like me, followed every single rule and made incredible sacrifices. Many young people are struggling with their mental health more than ever, and many are also still struggling educationally. I feel incredibly frustrated by how the decisions were made, particularly didn't seem to take into account disabled young people, those living in poverty, or those without the technology to complete schoolwork at home. And then there's Sarah, 10 years. During the time of COVID, all young people lost their voice. Support systems for SEN and neurodivergent young people drastically declined due to the inability to have meetings in person. For the most part, this group of young people were left practically abandoned. The mental health and well-being of children had one of the greatest falls during COVID period. The level of fear the pandemic inflicted onto our generation is startling. Young people now are a lot more introverted. They seem to avoid going out. And this makes perfect sense, because when you tell a child that there are germs everywhere and that if you get infected, you and your family could die, that will leave a psychological damage. Emotionally based school avoidance has spiked in recent years, and it's clear to see that COVID played a part in this. Young people felt safer in their homes, away from germs. So that was the first thing, my lady, I wanted to do. And the second thing, rather shorter period of time, is to actually pose what they want to know, or what they hope this module can do for them. Many children and young people are highly knowledgeable about the ways in which they were let down, and they have real insight into what was and is required. And in general, in Northern Ireland, they want to know 6 things. 1, why were they not made an integral part of any pre-pandemic plan, or once it was appreciated that COVID was likely to become a pandemic, why were they not factored into planning from the outset, especially as they were highly represented in vulnerable groups? 2, why those who had particular knowledge of their circumstances or who had direct contact with them were not properly consulted or involved in planning for the response to COVID, especially as it was known that there had been insufficient or inadequate pre-pandemic planning and that there was an urgent need to respond and absolutely no time for government to play catch-up. 3, why, when plans began to develop in haste, was no real consideration given to how some of the most dramatic measures, such as lockdown and school closure, would impact on them, nor why those working with them were not consulted to make use of their experience, especially as they were ready to assist. 4, why the plans and measures introduced failed to include adequate mitigating measures to avoid or at least reduce some of the most harmful impacts on them. 5, what coordinated work is being done now by the government to identify the full implications of some of the consequences of the pandemic and the measures introduced in response that have particularly affected them, such as long COVID, lost learning, decreased school attendance, increased economic deprivation, reduced life chances, long-term mental health issues and epigenetic responses, and what is now in place to help them. And then finally, what is being done now to improve planning, given the well-publicised resource constraints in Northern Ireland, and how will they be involved to improve pre-pandemic planning, pandemic responses, and ensure their rights are properly protected? To date, my lady, children and young people in Northern Ireland do not consider that they have received any meaningful answers or explanations, and they truly look to the inquiry, particularly this module, in the hope that it will help them with that.